Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Those of you who could tear yourselves away from the drama of this day, we're grateful that you did. We'll all sort of chill out and look to the past and hope it illuminates the future a bit. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, I'm delighted to welcome you to a long anticipated, yet as it turns out, extraordinarily timely event, the inaugural David Dubinsky program at Roosevelt House. Its first installment just happens to have been inspired by an institution you may have been focusing on in the last 48 hours, the U.S. Supreme Court. In this case, the court's landmark Janus decision and its impact on labor. So an event dedicated to labor history and to one of its most unforgettable historical figures is as current as any public policy discussion could be, and as current as any issue was that David Dubinsky ever took up with his energy and his passion. Let me start off with a bit of recent history, in this case, how this event, which is the first in what we anticipate will be an annual labor discussion here at Roosevelt House, how it came to be. And that story begins with Rina Appleton Siegel, the generous and thoughtful donor who has made this series possible. Our neighbor Rina came to us about a year ago and proposed supporting Roosevelt House and its mission. In turn, we proposed creating and hosting an annual public program here in memory of both her mother, Jean Appleton, and her father, David Dubinsky, Rina's illustrious grandfather. And that's how it all began. And we remember, of course, David Dubinsky as a leading figure in the labor movement and in local and national political life, and someone who has a connection to our mission here at Roosevelt House, as I hope you can see illuminated by our visuals here. Not only a really searing and penetrating photograph of Mr. Dubinsky, but a couple of pictures that show he's in very good company with Eleanor and with Franklin. Your printed program tonight, of course, includes Mr. Dubinsky's biography. Let me just add a few additional words. Born in Belarus, raised in Poland, where he got both his early education and his start as a working person, delivering bread for his father's bakery. He first came to the United States at age 19 and went right to work in a garment factory. The New York labor movement would never be the same. Within just a few years, he had emerged as a champion of his brother and sister workers, eventually rising to serve as secretary-treasurer and then president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. As a political force, his unwavering support for Franklin Roosevelt, both during the New Deal and later as the president inched closer to the inevitable fight against fascism, earned Dubinsky a place in history, as well as the friendship and gratitude of the embattled president who once called this building his home. Dubinsky was also a leader of the American Labor Party, as well as a founder of the once mighty Liberal Party. You students who are reading about Working Family Party endorsements, it was that way times 20 when the Liberal Party was at its peak, running its own candidates or endorsing Democrats or occasionally Republicans for state office. But always first and foremost, Dubinsky was an organizer, negotiator, and champion of his workers, a voice for the voiceless. By the time he retired from the ILGWU in 1965, at age 73, the union counted 20 times as many members as when he had started, nearly 500,000 in all. And David Dubinsky was also a New York fixture, as some of you will remember, quoted and quotable, a leader whose advice and counsel and influence were important to a citywide election campaign, as important as an editorial endorsement from the New York Times, Steve. I mean, it was important. He even got to take Eleanor Roosevelt to a performance of the legendary Garment Workers musical Pins and Needles. So we feel the family connection to this house is well established. So I want to thank Raina and the extended Dubinsky family for honoring us by supporting what we hope will be an illuminating living tribute to him. Discussions on labor and its role in the 21st century and its challenges. Before I welcome our speakers, please let me acknowledge and greet and ask to come to the podium our friend Raina Siegel, whose generosity and commitment, as I said, have made this series possible. And we'd love her to say a few words about the legacy she so proudly represents. Raina.
Thank you. Well, Harold stole a little of my thunder, but no, and gladly. But I have some comments that I would love to make. Good evening and welcome. I am very honored and pleased that through my mother's estate, we are able to present this inaugural David Dubinsky Labor Lecture here at Roosevelt House. My grandfather had a warm and long friendship and working relationship with the President and Mrs. Roosevelt, and I think he would be deeply gratified and approve. Thank you to Roosevelt House and its wonderful staff for making this possible. My grandfather arrived in America on January 1st, 1911, a 19-year-old Bundist labor leader who had been exiled to Siberia by the Tsarist police for his labor and political activities. He fought and advocated all his life for a fair deal for working women and men, and the ILGWU, which became a powerhouse for economic and social justice and democracy, nationally and internationally, pioneered programs which enriched its members' lives in many ways and set a pattern for the greater labor movement. My grandfather was an irrepressible force of nature, compassionate and passionate. He made his life count, and I believe he left the world a better place. Tonight's timely topic both comments on the state of labor today and reminds us that the good fight is never over. I hope you enjoy the evening, and thank you very much for coming.
So the Janus decision, which is the subject of our discussion tonight, is complicated, of course controversial, you know that. So we wanted to provide a few minutes of context, and we have the perfect person to provide that. He is the executive director of Hunter's National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions. So please welcome, for context setting, our friend Bill Herbert.
So thank you, Harold. Harold asked me to cover a century's worth of history in 3 minutes. We're both from Queens, so we can do it. So I want to thank Harold for his leadership at Roosevelt House and for his scholarship. As Harold mentioned, I run the National Center. We're a labor management research center at Hunter. Our board of advisors include administrators like Harold, as well as unions like the AFT. Next April, we're going to be doing an entire conference, a 2.5-day conference, with the theme of collective bargaining after Janus. So what did the Supreme Court do? In June 27th, the Supreme Court issued a decision called Janus v. AFSCME. It was a 5-4 decision, reversing 4 decades of precedent concerning the constitutionality of what is known as the agency shop in government employment. The agency shop basically requires that non-members contribute to the cost of being represented by their union. They don't have to join the union, but they have to pay a fee tied with that. It's pretty simple. It's an equitable concept, analogous to a citizen being required to contribute to the cost of governmental policies that they disagree with, right? We all do that right now. In Janus, however, the Supreme Court concluded that requiring non-members to pay their fair share was unconstitutional under the First Amendment. Writing for the majority, Justice Alito found that making non-members contribute to services that they benefit from constitutes a form of compelled speech, and it therefore is unconstitutional under the First Amendment. By striking down agency shop, the Supreme Court made right to work, a phrase you're probably familiar with, as a constitutional mandate for the first time. Now, demands for right to work are nothing new. They date back to the first Gilded Age of the 19th century, and the core purpose of right to work has always been to undermine the strength and effectiveness of labor representation. What is new under Janus is that it is now constitutionally mandated in the government workplace. Now, right to work took off after World War II with the enactment of the Taft-Hartley Act, which gave states the right to impose right to work in the private sector. And for the next 70 years, the battles have been state by state on questions of whether or not these states can enact laws to impose right to work. And the opponents of that have always been the labor movement and the civil rights movement have been key in terms of fighting that form of legislation. Now, it's appropriate for us to be discussing Janus in the inaugural David Dubinsky program at Rosa House. Dubinsky was a fierce and consistent opponent of right to work. The tenor of his opposition is revealed in this 1959 statement. The chiseler hides behind the Taft-Hartley Act. He uses state anti-labor laws as a shield in his fight to keep earnings low, hours long, and profits high. In the chiseler's hands, these laws are used not to clean unions, but to kill them. So it's also very appropriate to have Randi Weingarten with us today. 50 years ago, pretty much this month, the UFT played a key role in the history of agency shop in New York. The agency shop, in fact, was one of the core demands by Al Shanker to settle the Ocean Hill-Brownsville strike. After that, the UFT and DC 37 later persuaded John Lindsay to advocate for changes in the Taylor law that led to the agency shop becoming an essential element of government labor relations in New York. And as a result of Janus, however, the agency shop fee is now prohibited for all public workers. Should point out that Lindsay, who was a liberal, ran on the liberal line, Lindsay, and was supported by Dubinsky, Lindsay argued for the agency shop because it would provide labor peace in New York. And the Supreme Court, in the decision issued by Justice Alito, said that labor peace is not a sufficient reason for requiring non-members to have to pay for their union's representation. Kind of interesting in this climate that's going on right now that the Supreme Court would be saying we're not worried about labor peace. But I think it's important though for us to identify some silver linings emanating from Janus. First, the court found that all public sector collective bargaining is political and subject to the First Amendment protections. This opens the door for challenges against legal barriers to bargaining in other states like Virginia, South Carolina, West Virginia, and elsewhere where collective bargaining in the public sector is unlawful. Second, and more importantly, the case has become a catalyst for renewed activism by union-represented public sector employees. And when we consider that activism, along with the strikes by school teachers early this year in other states who don't have collective bargaining, along with the Me Too movement, I think we have good reason to be hopeful for the future. Thank you.
As Bill says, only someone from Queens could get through all that in 3 minutes. The only problem is that only people from Queens can follow it. That's the only difficulty. But I did, because as he says. So we have the perfect discussants tonight to take us into the impact of Janus and the prospects for the future. For 9 years, Randi Weingarten has served as the president of the 1.7 million member American Federation of Teachers. Before that, she was for 12 years president of the UFT, representing 200,000 educators in New York City. She has served on education reform panels and has chaired the Municipal Labor Committee, and she is a leading spokesman for equity and justice for professionals in education. And as those of you who read and those of you who haven't should read her op-ed piece in today's New York Times, she is an advocate for students as well, especially those who are burdened with intolerable, almost unconscionable debt. So read the op-ed. Stephen Greenhouse is no stranger to the New York Times because he worked there for 19 years. He is the former labor and workplace reporter for the paper, and he is the author of the forthcoming book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. We'll have a discussion between Randy and Steve, and we will have a Q&A, which we encourage you to participate in, and then all of you will be invited upstairs to the Four Freedoms Room, the Roosevelt's original dining rooms, for a celebration in honor of Rhina and Randy and Steve. So Randy and Steve, please.
Well, very nice to be here tonight. Thanks for taking some time out from watching the Kavanaugh hearings. It's an honor to be part of the first David Dubinsky lecture series, and thanks very much, Raina, and thanks, Harold and William, and it's an honor to be with Randy.
And vice versa.
I just want to begin tonight to ask a moment of silence for a great labor educator who died this week, Lois Gray, who taught for 72 years at the Cornell School of Industrial Labor Relations. She taught Randy once upon a time, and she founded the Institute for Women in Work there, the Latino Leadership Center there, the International Worker Exchange Center at Cornell. She set up the first program in New York State to train female arbitrators, and she's just a wonderful woman. I remember she told me about when she began teaching at Cornell, she taught alongside the great Frances Perkins, who, and I remember reading that, who came to this building to be interviewed about whether she had become labor secretary. Anyway, just a moment of silence for the great Lois Gray. Thank you. So it's an honor to be with Randy. Randy Weingarten, I've known for quite a long time, from when you were just a lawyer and then a teacher and then president of the UFT, and I'm president of the AFT. And as president of the AFT, Randy has really turned the union into one of the biggest, most powerful, most aggressive, fastest growing unions. It's gone from 1.2 million to 1.7 million in the past few years. Not many unions can say that, but it's also one of the most embattled unions in the country. And the Janus decision is a major, major blow to the big public sector unions, the National Education Association, the American Federation of State County Municipal Employees, the SEIU, and the AFT. And there are estimates that as a result of this decision, the big public employees unions will lose between 10% and 33% of their members and their dues. And if you wonder why the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and company were helping to fund the litigation, it's because they want to weaken public sector unions, because public sector unions represent everything bad to them. They want higher salaries for public sector workers and better benefits, which means higher taxes, and it also stands for big government. So there really is this effort by the plutocrats to really weaken the public sector unions, because they see them as a pillar of the Democratic Party. So Randy, I wanted to ask, how will the Janus decision affect your union and the other big public sector unions? How much damage do you expect it to mean?
So, we'll actually know the answer to that question over the course of the next 2 years. With our union, we always have, because we have a whole bunch of teachers, and I want to also say thank you for doing this. And I also want to say, frankly, and Billy, I thought this was the historic marker you were going to raise. David Dubinsky and Harry Van Arsdale were key to the establishment of the UFT. And one of the things we learned early on when we tell our origin story is how important it is to build on each other's shoulders. They had the power, and they saw the importance of teachers being represented and being able to collectively bargain. And so my honor is being here to be in this moment in the inaugural lecture. So I am very, very moved and honored that you thought of us doing this. Thank you. Really, thank you. So and in some ways, the history also helps answer that question. I often will tease, I'm a social studies teacher, so I need to always talk about history. But the Janus is, I don't see Janus as having a silver lining. I disagree with Billy on that. I see some unintended benefits that have come out of it. And the reason I say those two things separately is because when you look at what Alito did in that decision, it is, and this is part of the real fight on Kavanaugh and the fight on Gorsuch, it is an undermining of the expansion of rights and opportunity. It is using the Constitution, and if you haven't, please read Justice Kagan's dissent. It is using the Constitution to actually undermine economic rights. And it's doing it for the entrenchment of the status quo power in the United States, political power and economic power, which is why the Koch brothers and the DeVos family and others were there. In fact, Betsy DeVos actually snuck into the case, snuck into the hearing at the last minute, not on her public calendar. But let's put that aside for a second, okay? Bad law, it's there. Maybe one day it will get reversed. The unintended benefit of the case, even though if one had to do it again, I would rather have had the 40 years of precedent for all sorts of reasons. The unintended benefit is that it forced us to actually think about our roots in a 2018 way, not in a 1950s way, of thinking through what is the value of belonging? What is the value of a union? Not just the bad guys hate us, and therefore to fight the bad guys, we get organized, but what is the purpose? And to start telling the origin story again, but not to say, oh, this is why our forefathers and foremothers did this. How do you create power? You create power through numbers, through engagement, through collective bargaining, through power at the ballot box and the bargaining table. How do people see that? What people were doing was they basically were thinking that the social contract in a union was you elected your leaders, outsourced your power to your leaders, and then your leaders would do everything. It was a transaction. What we're trying to do in this transition is make the power of the union organic again to the membership, and the membership actually seeing that and feeling that. So engagement, connecting. Our motto at our convention was, we care, we fight, we show up, we care, we fight, we show up, and now we vote. And our other motto was and is, how do you think about what the purpose of unionism is? For people to have a better life, your members and the community you serve. So, member engagement and community involvement over issues that really matter, not things that don't. And how do you do that? And so it started with, in February 2015, Lee Saunders came to our executive council, and we had a real heart-to-heart conversation with our executive council all around the country.
Lee Saunders is the head of the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Footnote.
And he, in terms of AFSCME and us in AFT, and then broadly with NEA and with SEIU, we have all started thinking about unionism as engagement, social justice engagement, political engagement, economic engagement, not just over bread and butter issues, but really starting with values and starting with member conversations. And so, this is the spoiler alert. In the last 3 months, I expected, given what we had seen in the last year, that we would have less than a 10% drop. I expected that we'd have a drop of the agency fee payers, fair share payers, and maybe 1%, 2, 3, 4% more, because we have about 5% agency fee. What we're seeing, and again, we need to see for a year, is that the members are sticking with the union. And what we're also seeing, so we're seeing less than a 1% drop. And what we're also seeing is that in all the new teacher orientations, there is a tremendous resurgence of understanding that a union, that collectively you can do what is impossible individually, and that the union as an organization, as an organism, is something that that people, young people, are interested in if they can mold it.
Does everyone understand what agency fees are? So no one can be required in the United States to belong to a union. You can, if your workplace unionizes, you can pay full union dues, or you could say, I don't agree with the union supporting Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, so you become, you're no longer a member of the union, but you pay something called an agency fee, which is normally about 80% of full union dues. And in states that are not right to work, you have to, and you're represented by a union, you have to pay agency fees. Janice says, tells the 10, 20, 30% of people represented by various unions that you no longer have to pay agency fees, and you can get the milk for free. You can get something for nothing. You can get the union to bargain for you, the union to handle grievances for you without you having to pay. So there's a big challenge for the public sector unions to persuade people to be members or continue paying agency fees. But how is that working on the ground? How are you going in Minnesota and New Jersey and other states telling members on the ground, stick with us?
So it's, and there's one more complication that Steve didn't raise, which is that many of us have made the decision that we are going to bargain for everyone regardless. We believe in exclusive representation, we believe in the power of equity, and we believe in the power of belonging and the power of all. So and there's been a debate amongst and between unions, but we feel very strongly about that, and it's something that, Steve may get to this or not, it's actually something that's quite adverse to what Justice Alito believes in. We believe that's going to be another case. He's going to, and about exclusive representation. But we believe that we should represent all, and all should be covered by a contract, regardless of whether they pay a fair share or not. And I call them fair share, not agency fees. I think what happens is this. How many school teachers are here? How many people are here who have worked in a job site where you've sat around with coworkers at a lunchroom table? At least once in your life. Okay, that's enough that I can now do the analogy. Okay, if the conversation in the lunchroom is, I hated what Randy did 10 years ago and I'm dropping the union because of it, then you know we're in trouble. If the conversation is about we're stronger when we're together, we're not going to get as good a contract unless we're together, we're not going to have the rights that we have now, not just what do we need to get, but we're not going to have what we have now. We need to show the boss that we're all together. If that's the conversation, then we have moved a unit. And if there's one or two people who are silent, it means that they're ultimately going to join or stay. If so the question then became for us, how do you get to that conversation in the lunchroom? And it's not simply having a 30-second conversation about benefits. Benefits are important. Like, for example, one of the things we do now is we have student debt clinics because in nursing and teaching, there is a program that George W. Bush actually signed that says if you work in the public sector as a nurse, as a teacher, and you have paid your loans for 10 years, then the rest of your loan is forgiven. Now, it just so happens that 28,000 people actually applied for that this year, and Betsy DeVos gave 96 people the protections of it. And that's essentially what my op-ed is about. But my point is, we have had over 10,000 people go to our student debt clinics where we are teaching people how to do this. This is part of the common good. This is part, so that's a benefit. You know, indemnity insurance is a benefit. If you're just having a conversation about benefits, I think we've lost. The conversation has to be about how do we ensure that you, your colleagues, we, not me, not another leader, how do we collectively fight for you, your colleagues, our kids, our communities, to have safe and welcoming schools, to have a better life, to make sure that our kids are doing better than we did, to have a living wage. And so that is basically, starts with conversations with people, but that's basically the conversation. And sometimes it's around contracts, sometimes it's around other issues. It's almost always around campaigns, but starts with engagement.
So it's often...
And we've had over 1 million of them. I think we've had at this point, and we've had over, in the last 6 months, over 560,000 people of the 800,000 people affected by Janus. Over 560,000 people have already signed recommitment cards.
So it's often said that Janus will hurt the public sector unions most in the bluest states, California, New York, Massachusetts, Washington, Oregon, where public sector unions are strongest. And one of the surprises of the past year is that we've seen, in ways, the most labor activism in the reddest of states. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia might be very red, depending on how you assess it. We've seen this eruption of teacher strikes, also in Kentucky and Colorado, not so red, little in North Carolina. But I wanted to ask you,
But they have Tabor.
Yes.
They have laws that basically have stopped investment in public institutions.
So my question is, why in these states where unions are quite weak, including the teachers' unions, why did we see this burst of activism in those states?
So I would actually say, give the Trump election some credit for this.
I give the women's movement a lot of credit.
No, I would do, the women's marches were, and I actually agree with Michelle Alexander, who wrote in her kind of inaugural op-ed for the New York Times, we are actually the forward-facing people. In some ways, the resistor is Donald Trump, trying to go back to a world that doesn't exist anymore and trying to pit people against each other. We are actually looking for a world that's better. So the women's marches to the day after the inauguration, I think were a huge reason for the teacher strikes in these red states. And I say that, so the answer I'm supposed to give you is this: the lack of investment in these states, and that people had nothing to lose. They had been so downtrodden, they had nothing to lose. But that's gone on for a long time. So what created the spark and the hope of the possible? And that was the activism. That all of a sudden, a lot of people could show up together. And in some ways, they were acting in some ways with the mobilization of together you can accomplish what is impossible to accomplish individually. And so, and I would also give a lot of credit to social media, because you can go to a meeting these days and you're not going to get a lot of people. A lot of people have a lot of things to do. We get a lot of people still for our conventions. Actually, we had one of the biggest conventions ever this year. But unless there is a climate of activism, so what happened was in West Virginia, people, rank and filers, got fed up that they had no power. And going to the legislature, it didn't matter. We got dismissed and disparaged. Remember the Time magazine cover, Michelle Rhee sweeping people out? That's the climate in Oklahoma. That was the climate in West Virginia. And so what it took was actually pretty intense organization combined with amazing mobilization of the rank and file. It was a both and to actually put on the strikes in West Virginia. It was not a wildcat in any way. What was an aspect of a push and pull was that we told the governor after we settled the strike that it needed a 2 or 3 day cooling off period. And do not go out and announce the 5% and there was a 5% increase, and then there was a moratorium on the healthcare costs. We say to him, the people who are in the room, do not announce it. We need to talk to people first. We need to have like ratification meetings, talking to people. He goes out, announces it. Nobody trusts him. People immediately say boo. And then ultimately, it took a little while to pull it back together again. After the strike, we are up in West Virginia, just so you know, 10% increase in membership.
So I was out in Arizona recently, and I interviewed you for this story, doing a story about the Koch brothers group, Americans for Prosperity, and they have a group focused on Latinos called Libre, and Betty DeVos, the DeVos family, has another group called the American Federation for Children. They have humongous sway over the government of Arizona. I was astounded about how they almost pull the lawmakers as puppets, which have all sorts of vouchers and underfunding of public schools, and a lot of teachers' starting pay is $33,000. You read about teachers who actually make more money, make higher amount per hour working fast food than teaching, and
selling plasma.
And selling plasma, and I think one of the reasons for the strikes is these teachers are, as you say, fed up, but they see that their state governments, the Republicans in power, want to do a tax cut every year to get reelected, and use more and more public money to finance charters, and the public school teachers say, this has to stop.
Yeah.
We're not getting raises, and more public school money is going to private schools. And I think that fueled the Facebook page and others.
Right.
So I wanted to...
That's the investment. That's
Yeah.
why I said fed up and the lack of
Right.
investment.
So with the right still having a firm hold in Oklahoma, West Virginia, Arizona, many other states, in the light of Janus, which is aimed to weaken you, what will the teachers union, what will the public sector's unions do next after these strikes and to gain more power?
So, first off, the one thing we don't have is we do not have a magic wand. And part of what we have is we have the power you have through organization and through mobilization. And I use 3 T words as Steve made me think about this and said to me, don't look at your notes, just have a real conversation. But I think about, we're in a transition as the labor movement and public sector unions. In the last 2 decades, we've been very transactional. We have to be transformative. And and some of that is baby steps, and some of that is gallops. So the human shield that's why I called 40,000 people in the street in Arizona, that is a human shield. 35,000 people in Oklahoma, that's a human shield. Oklahoma, Arizona, and West Virginia were different than the other 3 because people stayed out for a long time. And this is the big secret. Our bosses supported us. In West Virginia, the schools were closed by the superintendents. People still got paid. We did a whole bunch of stuff in terms of helping kids get fed. No superintendent of the 55 counties would agree to bring the injunction against us. And part of that was because of they were unsuccessful in getting the investment because of all the things that Steve said, the Koch brothers, this, that. So the protest is really important, and the willingness to protest and to continue to protest if necessary is important. But you need to have those allies. They are absolutely imperative. And the more, in all three of these places, people were just waiting for the public to stop supporting us. But instead, clergy, students in West Virginia, coal miners, very important in terms of the support. To answer Steve's question, read Dark Money, Jane Mayer's book. Because what you see in Arizona, you see in a lot of different places. If we do not win some elections, then we will not be successful. Because we have to, the same reasons as they're trying to starve us, is the reasons that we have to actually win elections to transform and change the power dynamic. We don't have to win it all this year, but we have to win some on a state level. And what is amazing is that I was just in Oklahoma last weekend with Elizabeth Warren in her hometown high school. Her brother, some of her cousins came. This just happened in Oklahoma. 15 of the 19 Republicans that voted against the tax increase, that were basically wholly owned subsidiaries of the Koch brothers and of the oil and gas interests, they are not returning to the legislature. This is before November. They were either defeated in primaries or decided not to run. And as we did the meet and greet with Elizabeth, we had the Democratic candidate, who's a school teacher, who is running in Norman, Oklahoma for the state legislature, and the Republican candidate, who is a school teacher, who is running for that same seat in Norman, Oklahoma. And we had in that room a packed auditorium on a Saturday competing with football. We had in that room over 30 candidates who are creating great inspiration. We have 2 teachers who are in the legislature now. So when I say this is still red state areas, what if we win 2 more or 4 more? And that it is a step and it is a strategy of sometimes you can take big steps and sometimes you take baby steps, but it is that kind of organization strategy.
So one little appreciated aspect of the Janus decision is that if Merrick Garland had made it to the Supreme Court rather than Neil Gorsuch, I never know how to pronounce it, the decision would have come out differently, and unions would not be nearly on the defensive. Now, I know there are some students of labor relations in the back of this room, and remember that when Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, it created exclusive representation, meaning when a majority of workers at a private sector employer vote to have a union, then that union represents 100% of the workers in that workplace. And in many states, when they enacted laws for public sector unions for teachers and government workers like AFSCME and DC 37 and UFT and the Sanitation Workers Union, they have exclusive representation. So Justice Samuel Alito, when he came to the court, he came with a mission to really weaken public sector unions. And he had this idea of using the First Amendment as a way to do that. And Randy's absolutely right. Lena Kagan's dissent in Janus is brilliant. And she says, look, world, we really have to look out that the conservative majority of the Supreme Court is using the First Amendment as a sword. And Brett Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit.
Weaponized. She actually used the word
you
weaponized.
Yes, thanks. So there was a decision whether to uphold the law, the regulation, the Obama-era regulation requiring net neutrality, saying Comcast, you big, Verizon, you big companies, you have to allow everyone equal access on the internet. And Brett Kavanaugh ruled that that violates the First Amendment rights of Comcast and Verizon, that they should be able to limit internet access or charge newspapers more, say, than others, or right-wing publications more than. So, anyway, so Alito really introduced the whole idea of creating right to work for public sector unions. And in the Janus decision, he very cleverly inserts a sentence saying, well, exclusive representation for public sector employees. If you don't like unions and you're in a unionized workplace and it's bargaining for you, that might be violating your First Amendment rights because they're speaking for you and maybe you don't want to speak to them. So the Koch brothers, other right-wing folks are now financing some cases that are just gathering steam to
Wending their way.
they hope go to the Supreme Court to overturn exclusive representation of public sector workers. Now I'm getting to my long-winded question. So are you very worried about that, Randy? Or some people say that might be a relief for public sector unions because maybe you won't have to provide grievances
Right.
for workers whom you no longer represent.
So these days, I am worried about any time anybody uses or resorts to one of the levers of this particular federal government. Because there is not, so for example, we now do private agreements in graduate worker organizing. We did it with Brown. We have done it with Georgetown, as opposed to using the National Labor Relations Act. Because we are actually worried that there is such an ideological fixation against any economic or collective power of regular people, they will find a way to squash it under this current regime. And so, yes, I am worried, but the flip side is this. That case did not get cert. It went up to the court this year. Cert was declined, and meaning it couldn't, 4 judges, to get certiorari, 4 judges have, and Gorsuch was already on the court, Alito was already in the court. They did not get 4 judges to say that should be heard by the court. So, but the second piece is, Justin, I was saying this to Steve right before we started, today, the second case this time came out of Minnesota that basically has sustained and affirmed exclusive representation. Now, why does the right wing, and the quote that you did about David Dubinsky is a perfect example of why. The right wing wants to chisel every right away. So the reason they want Kavanaugh so much is because they really want to chisel away gay marriage, reproductive rights, labor rights. They are fixated on getting rid of labor rights, civil rights. They have a view of what the country ought to be, and it's probably not the same as in this room. And so they see exclusive representation as a way of creating collective economic strength. And so the reason they want to disrupt that is so that they can pit people against people. So they could say, oh, I like Steve really a lot, and I hate Randy. Therefore, I'm going to call Steve in, and I'm going to say, Steve, you get a 30% raise. Just say, disclaim that you're represented by the union. That is what they're trying to do. That's why they also try to suppress voting rights, and they try to suppress school rights and school funding. They want people to fend for themselves in a world where they have the greatest amount of power, and they want people to have no power. So worried, I'm always worried about everything. I'm Jewish. I'm a labor leader. But I think it's not gonna happen for a year or two.
One or two more thoughts. So
Okay.
Brett Kavanaugh, I think people, there's been a lot of talk about him, but people don't realize how anti-union he is. There are 2 extremely anti-union decisions he was involved in. One coming out of Brooklyn involving the meat processing company, AgriProcessors,
It's horrible.
which has a reputation of treating its workers badly and its undocumented workers especially badly. So there was a union vote at its facility in Brooklyn, and the workers voted for a union. And after the union vote, lo and behold, AgriProcessors magically discovers that we've hired some undocumented workers. We didn't realize that. And they should not be counted as part of the union vote. And it's kind of reward. So the three-judge panel, including Kavanaugh, ruled to overturn the unionization election, saying, you can't count undocumented workers as part of a union vote. So, AgriProcessors had very unclean hands, but you're still rewarding them in that case. And the other case involving Trump Casino in Atlantic City, I think some congressmen and some state legislators held a rally in support of the union a few days before the union vote, and 3 conservatives on the D.C. Circuit ruled that the vote was invalid, that basically a press conference by a few public officials in support of the union, they say that improperly tainted the election, which is, when you consider how all these southern governors and state senators rail against unions, it's like, wow. Anyway, so 1 or 2 questions, not about Janice. So there seems to be a split in the labor movement about how to react to Trump. He's clearly, he's clearly been bad to the public sector unions, but you see the steel workers and the auto workers saying, well, we like what he's doing on NAFTA, we're sort of happy what he's doing on steel and aluminum tariffs. And, Richard Trumka says, kind of smartly, we're approaching it with balls and strikes. He's doing some things we like, but he's doing a lot of things we really can't stand, and we'll call him as we see him. So I wanted to ask you your sense of how Donald Trump is doing regarding labor, and why is it that so many union members are quite happy with Trump?
Well, I'm not sure that they're happy with Trump, but I think what you're seeing is if you read a history of the UAW, and when the UAW started working on social justice issues, you started seeing some of the same things as you're seeing now. There is one of the things that the labor movement has done in an extraordinary way. It has actually created a value system within our movement of fighting for equity and opportunity for all and against bigotry and hate. And what Donald Trump was able to do very effectively was that he took the power of grievance and the frustration that people have and used it to morph it into the fear of the other. So essentially, it's immigrants that are the reason why, this is him, not me, obviously. It's immigrants who are the reason why we no longer have retirement security or good wages, as opposed to globalization, greed, all sorts of other things. And our movement, because of the frustration that people feel, has been susceptible to some of those arguments. And so what has happened, frankly, is that there's actually been far less of a split than I feared at the beginning. If you remember, the day after the Women's March, Trump invited the building trades and other basically disproportionately white men who lead unions to the White House and had a picture with them. And they were trying to create this divide. Bannon was trying to do this. And what has happened instead is that we have actually worked together on issues like family separation, like the Supreme Court. The private sector worked with us and helped us in the fight on Janice. And we are supporting the private sector in trying to get a better NAFTA deal. So we are trying to actually see if there are things that we can get done, but the movement is far less split. That doesn't mean that people others, that there will not still be people who vote for Trump and vote their fears, not their aspirations. And so what the movement has also done is, if you'll hear a lot of people talk about issues and values as opposed to talking about Trump. I talk about DeVos all the time. I talk about Trump all the time, because in my union, we see them as synonymous. But in other places, it's kind of like the little ditty we learn as school teachers. It's not what you say, it's what's heard. And so ultimately, it is about the values, and the values are similar.
So one more question before we open up for questions. So, surprise, 2016, Donald Trump won the election, despite what Nate Silver and many other people were predicting. And the states that really turned the election were considered states which, where unions are quite strong. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. So why?
Or used to be strong.
Which used to be strong. So why couldn't the unions keep those states in the blue column? And then, looking forward to 2018 and 2020, what is labor doing to change that?
So I can give you the easy answer, and I can give you the hard answer.
We want both.
Okay. The easy answer is, if you take Wisconsin, where I just was this week, and I actually not only talked at the AFL-CIO convention yesterday, but I walked with a block organizer, which is the Black Leadership Organizing Committee, and we did canvassing, and I did a silent canvass listening to her actually talk to people and listening to what people were saying. Fascinating, the frustration, the depth of despair, and feeling that nothing will ever change. Wisconsin, we lost we lost about 150,000 union members. On top of that, 200,000 people were taking off the voting rolls. Hillary Clinton lost by 22,000 votes. Now, I love the woman, but should have she been in Wisconsin? Yes, she should have been in Wisconsin. You have to remember what I said at the beginning. We fight, we care, we fight, we show up. I don't care if you get booed. You got to show up, you got to walk around, you got to look at people.
We have
Michigan,
to show up to show we care. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you have to show up. And so, Michigan, 10,000 votes. Pennsylvania, 30,000. I think that collectively it was 70,000 votes. 3 precincts in these 3 states turned it around. Now, Comey turned it around, the Russians turned it around, all sorts of other things turned it around as well. But I always think about, what is it that we can control? And if you look at Wisconsin now, there is such Walker fatigue. It's not Trump, but it's Walker fatigue, and there's a real shot at winning that governorship and also winning a bunch of seats in Wisconsin. Same in Michigan.
Any questions from the audience? Wait for the microphone, please.
I have a granddaughter in Oklahoma, so I was very interested when you say the word Oklahoma.
Where is she?
She's in Stillwater, Oklahoma State. You had mentioned something about teachers being inspired in Oklahoma, and I wanted to know what specifically you meant by that.
So look, when you are all there is a sense. There's a lot of places over the course of the last 15 years where people, or let's say 10 to 15 years, where people felt nothing's going to change. Even and teachers in particular. And look, I'm completely biased about teachers. I love teachers. I love what they do. And we never do enough for them in any real way. But what they do is they try to do more with less. They try to figure it out. regardless of what gets thrown at them. But the level of frustration in a place like Oklahoma, it felt so hopeless. And what they saw was that after West Virginia, because it was a red state and was a state that didn't have collective bargaining, they said, if it happens in West Virginia, it can happen in Oklahoma. I was in West Virginia the first day of the strike, the last day of the strike. And the last day, you heard people in West Virginia in the Capitol say, West Virginia first, Oklahoma next. And then you heard people in Oklahoma, like on social media, do the same thing. And there was a sense that if we do something together, we will get something from it. And that's the sense of hope that's there right now. It's not wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. It's not, nobody's going to start singing up the Broadway song Oklahoma. But it is a sense of, okay, now we have to win some elections because we have to change policy.
I'm going to add one or two answers. So 2010, the Republicans won control of many states because they ran on two issues, that they somehow persuaded all these people that Obamacare was terrible, and President Obama and the Democrats did not do nearly enough to fight on it. And secondly, not Obama's fault at all, the recovery from the recession was quite slow because it was this deep financial recession, and the Republicans are fighting any effective stimulus to really speed the recovery from the recession because McConnell says we're not going to do anything to help Obama. So now, as Randy says, there's great anger in many states about Trump, on women's issues, and on education.
And healthcare, you're
And on
absolutely
healthcare.
right.
And in West Virginia, the teacher strike began because the governor said, I'm going to give a raise of 1% a year for 5 years. And Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, they're all like 45, 47, 49th in teacher salaries. And you get these bozo governors saying, well, we'll give you 1%. In Arizona, he promised a 1% raise. And the starting salary there is like $33,000. And they've been promised a 20% raises as a result of the strike in Arizona. So people are really mad. And Oklahoma is the same type of thing. They give huge tax breaks to the Koch brothers and others in the oil and fracking industry. And the teachers say, what about us? We're getting paid $33,000, $35,000, $37,000. We're selling our blood plasma to make ends meet. So there's a lot of anger, and the question is whether that will be enough, as Randy said, to enable teachers and people who support education to win control in various legislatures.
And then the other thing that Steve didn't say was that 2010 was a really bad year to lose that much because it was a census year. And the gerrymandering that has happened in so many states, frankly, means that you have to win more than 51%. Nancy Pelosi said at a dinner recently that if 58% of Americans voted, the demographics, the power balance would be completely different. 58%.
Though it said that for the Democrats to win the House, they need an 8% margin, not
Right.
51%, 49%.
Yeah.
And that's after the Republicans already have a huge advantage in the Senate. Other questions?
Thank you. Thank you both for really stimulating conversation. Part of what you've been talking about is what led to the Trump vote. And you mentioned several things which I think are all operative: immigrants, economic security, hostility to Hillary, all that stuff. But I wonder if you could talk a little about the role of race and racism, because that comes up a lot in the discussion. And several months ago, The Nation had an article, and they were reporting on this, and they said that based on some study that they did, that the major predictor for pro-Trump vote was negative racial attitudes, and made the point that blacks were equally economically insecure as whites, so that maybe more so, so the economic insecurity, maybe it plays a role, but maybe we should, they didn't say this, but I mean, maybe we should frame it differently. It's a loss of economic security for them as opposed to blacks who are continually economically insecure. So anyway, I think the role of race, it's hard to have this discussion, I think, without mentioning that. So I was just curious. It hasn't come up, so I'd like you to talk about it.
I could handle that if you want.
Well, I mean, look, yes, the answer is, the real question was, were people ready to actually elect a female president? So there was a huge issue around the role of sex, as it's now being played out, and of race. And race, what you see in the data is that racial views played more of a role than class. And you see that in the data. And there is the xenophobia right now that is being used because of race. And it's being so that's so the question for me is constantly, how do you create enough trust in increasing circles, radiating out from your membership or from people who believe in social justice, that you create the kind of understanding that frankly has happened in this country in the last 10 years around the issue of marriage equality. And but the race conversation is intense, and frankly, it is, you have you have so many, it's so complicated in so many different ways, including the fact that many of us who are white, who don't think we are biased in any way, have a whole bunch of privilege that we have that our African American colleagues do not. And if we don't actually understand that, then that's also a problem. So yes, it played a huge role, but I actually believe in meeting people where I can and moving them. And that's what we try to do, which is why I start with a class, then race discussion, as opposed to starting with a race, then class discussion.
I'm going to add my 2 cents. I can't resist.
Of course.
So I covered labor at the New York Times for 19 of my 31 years there. And so when Trump won in these states, because in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, I thought it's because of all the factory shutdowns and all the wage stagnation. And that, I think in the beginning, was kind of the prevailing view. But race and misogyny, sexism was part of it. But there have been these recent studies over the past 6 months, and there's a new book coming out, I think, next week, that really says it's and they use the phrase racialized economics. That, okay, if you're pissed off about factory shutdowns or wage stagnation, it's not because your company's stiffing you on wages. It's because China is seeking a more dominant role in the world, and that's threatening America's superiority and dominance, and white working class folks' sense of superiority. And a lot of the white working class, the blue collar whites in these states were worried that Hispanics were taking their jobs, and they thought that African Americans had an advantage over them. And Trump, the genius of Trump, and it really was a genius, like he knew like a laser beam how to tap into this resentment. And it really resonated, and he got these. I mean, we were all amazed. Maybe there's some Trump supporters in the audience, but it was amazing to see the electric response he got when he was speaking in these states. Right. And a lot of it was on economic issues. A lot of it was on racial issues. I mean, there's this racialized economics, that Mexicans are rapists and they're coming here and they want to take our jobs. And that, unfortunately, I'd submit that's a racist view. That really resonated with millions and millions of Americans.
And then on top of it, you have the undermining of truths. You have most people getting their news from Facebook. And you have, frankly, the Democratic Party, I think, in my judgment, and look, I'm a member of the DNC, we have walked away from rural America. And part of this is if
Not just rural America, but working class America.
yes, that too. We've walked away from working class. But I would say the labor movement has attempted to mitigate that. But we have a responsibility to try and move to a place where people focus on aspiration instead of hate. Virtually every election is either about aspiration or fear. And Trump was very effective at resentment and grievance.
Now, there are a lot of students here. Do any students have a question? Go, okay, over there. I don't see any students raising their hands, so maybe you're a student. We're all students.
I'm not a student. I'm actually a faculty member at Hunter College and at CUNY. And of course, I'm an AFT member. And
Thank you.
and therefore relatively privileged among your members. But one of the things
Our
that...
members.
Beg your pardon?
Our members.
Okay, thanks. One of the things
good.
that I became far more aware of in the course of the teacher strikes of last year is the underprivilege of so many teachers. And in, I'm sure, many other states that we haven't even heard about yet, there was a very interesting photo essay, I believe it was in The Guardian, of teachers' second jobs. And it was really, shattering. So my question is, and this relates to just the last thing you said, my question is, what do you think the AFT should be doing as a strategy to elevate the conditions of these workers who are college graduates, who are dedicated to their work, and who are unable to raise their families on the salaries that they're making?
So this is one of those times when if we actually had $50 million to do an advertising campaign, this is the moment to do that. But we would not spend the first dollar on advertising. We'll spend it on organizing. We'll spend it on engagement, on collective bargaining, on strengthening locals, and on politics. But what we're seeing is that, frankly, in the latest, so the short answer is, at our last convention, we actually put out a document to every single local that actually shows the disinvestment by state. 25 states actually spend less on education than they did before 2008. 41 states actually spend less on higher education than they did before 2008. Part of why we're doing the focus on student debt is because I always like to pair the fight on something with a solution that we are trying to seek. And that also crosses state lines, it crosses divisional lines. That's part of the reason why we're very much focused economically on the issue of student debt. If we could get that debt down by $100 a month for most kids, that would be pretty amazing. One student from the community college of Miami-Dade Community College, left our student debt clinic with increasing her take-home pay by $900 a month because of being able to do this. So it's just kind of, but we are doing a whole bunch of this as part of the elections, a whole bunch of the fight about investments, lifting up members, lifting up what they earn, lifting a lot of this stuff up during the strikes as well as during the UTLA battle, which is the same exact thing. Even though it's in an urban battle, it's the same kind of thing. But we are trying to lift that up, but we're also trying to lift up not just economic issues for teachers, but in January, we're going to push very hard on the whole issue of voice and latitude. Voice and latitude. So let teachers teach instead of this kind of micromanagement of test scores.
Any other questions? Okay. You go on, yeah, let's.
And just follow my Twitter
Okay,
feed.
good.
I say something about it almost every day.
We'll
Hi,
do
thank
one
you for
more
coming
after this.
tonight. in watching the news and reading books and articles about what's happening in the labor movement today, I find that it seems like it's a battle of ideas and philosophies of how we are supposed to be building our society. And hearing you speak about it tonight made me think about what the fight is about as far as the ideas. And to me, it seems that people are fighting about who is responsible for creating opportunity, economic opportunity in our country. Is it society? Is society responsible for creating opportunity for each other, for ourselves? Or is it the individual who is responsible for themselves? And we already, I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory where each side is ideologies lay. What I would like to ask is this something that can be exploited, like in defining in the this sort of argument, so that we can maybe change people's philosophy from saying that we are only responsible for ourselves, rather than and change that mind to think that society is responsible for each other.
So this, you have just, my friend, hit on the...
That's the perfect softball pitch.
That
for her.
is the debate in America forever. Think about it. Rugged individualism, manifest destiny versus Roosevelt. Social Security, the Lockean social contract. So there are things that in our society, America still sees as communal. That's part of the reason why I talk very explicitly and intentionally about what they're trying to do. Yes, Betsy DeVos and I will never be friends. She believes in getting rid of public education. But they really believe in they use the market, they use disruption, they really believe that the rest of us have to fend for ourselves and that they get to keep what they have. And they use all of these things, as Steve was saying about tax cuts and the power to do that. But it is rooted in a philosophy that is very much American, that you can pull yourselves up by the bootstraps. Rugged individualism. And so what we try to do is say, wait a second, there are certain things that we create a ladder of opportunity for people. It's not a handout, it's a hand up, like public education, like infrastructure, like why is it that high school is free? College is the new high school. Shouldn't we make sure that we provide that for people? Isn't health care a right? Why should only the rich be assured that if they have a pre-existing condition, they'll be okay? Shouldn't that be everybody? And why don't we have collective bargaining so that people can actually, in a capitalist society, fight for the wages they deserve? So it is kind of a merger, a hybrid of social capitalism, of labor rights, of socialism the way in which Roosevelt talked about it, and of rugged individualism. And that
take one
is
more.
how
Okay,
we
okay,
have to
okay.
move forward.
My union workers are going to leave. With that, what a rousing way to
Okay,
head
thank you.
upstairs.
Okay.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Okay.